So, may mga certain health implications tayo if there are abnormalities on how the heart conducts electrical charges or how the heart beats. So, pag nagkaroon ng problema doon, that could result to certain pathological diseases that could compromise someone's life. Kaya it is really very important for us to know kung ano ba yung mga problema na nangyayari sa arrhythmic activity ng heart and how drugs address those issues. So my topics under drugs for arrhythmia is divided into several parts, starting with the concept of cardiac electrophysiology. In this regard, you will learn how the electrical charges are being transmitted from a certain part of the heart and para mapunta siya sa iba't ibang areas facilitating contraction. And then we will also discuss what's really the problem involved in the condition arrhythmia. And then we will also discuss the pathophysiology, of course, and then the treatment goals. Okay, the therapeutic goals. How will the drugs be used to correct the problem? And then finally, the pharmacological properties ng mga antiarrhythmic agents. So at this juncture, let us begin discussing the concept of cell electrophysiology. Of course, the cell that will be focused here is cardiac cell. Okay, basically, pag sinabing cardiac cell, di ba? These are the ones that are present in the heart, of course. And may mga certain physiological actions ang cardiac cells natin involving movement of electrical charges or ions. So very important that you have to understand the concept first because ito yung ina-alter ng drugs. Okay, ito yung ina-alter ng drugs, particularly under cell physiology, electrophysiology. I will start discussing cardiac action potential, followed by ECG or the electrocardiogram, then the concept of conduction velocity, also excitability of cardiac cells, and then finally, the terms chronotropy, yan yung heart rate, and yung dromotropy, yung conduction velocity, and how certain physiological actions in the body affects these processes in the heart. So at this juncture, balikan natin yung video na ni-require ko na panoorin nyo bago i-access itong recorded lecture video. So basically, in the video you just watched, if you all have observed in the electrical conduction system ng heart, so normal electrical system ng heart, there are important parts to be remembered. Okay, number one important part is yung sinoatrial node. Itong sinoatrial node. So, highlight ko ha, sinoatrial node. So, yung SA node, this is considered as the pacemaker. Take note, this is considered as the pacemaker of the heart. Again, normally, ang sinoatrial node, SA node, is the pacemaker of the heart. So, when we say pacemaker, it tells us na siya ang mag-i-initiate ng action potential. Siya ang mag-i-initiate ng heartbeat. Okay? So, kumbaga, sa iya mag-start normally. Okay, yung action potential. Sa iya mag-sugod. Other distinct areas here are the atrioventricular node. So, ito yung atrioventricular node. Ayan. So, this is also an important part, the AV node. Also, we have here the atrioventricular bundle. Ito. Kani siya, kani akong gi-highlight na violet. Yan yung atrioventricular bundles having the left and the right. Okay, having the left and the right atrioventricular bundle. And lastly, we have the Purkinje fibers. Purkinje fibers. So again ha, aside sa mga bundle branches, another important part is the Purkinje fibers. So ito yung mga Purkinje fibers. Okay, yung nilabel ko. Ayan. Kanya siya. Ayan, ito yung mga Purkinje fibers surrounding the ventricles. Okay? Yan yung ventricles. Okay, yung lateral part, particularly ng ventricles. Kasi ventricles din to. Okay, so sa lateral part ng ventricles, yan yung mga Purkinje fibers. Also an important part sa electrical conduction system ng heart. Okay? So they are again involved sa cardiac action potential. Okay, cardiac action potential. So very important yan sila na part. Throughout this lecture, always na ko ni sila ma-mention ha. Always na ko na ma-mention ang mga parts ng heart. The pacemaker, ulit, the pacemaker, the one that initiates the cardiac action potential. Dumdumi na siya. The one that initiates cardiac action potential. In the other distinct areas, we have the atrioventricular node or the AV node, the bundles, okay, and also the Purkinje system or the Purkinje fibers. So right now, let us begin discussing the cardiac action potential. Okay, based on the outline I have presented earlier about cell electrophysiology. So iba una yung cardiac action potential. So first things first. Okay, ano muna ibig sabihin ng action potential? Action potential. Of course, yung cardiac dyan, it refers to the heart. Diba? It refers to the heart. Ano muna yung action potential? Now, pag sinabing action potential, this has something to do with membrane potential. Okay, membrane potential. Again, pag sinabing action potential, this has something to do with membrane potential. With the term membrane potential, this means difference in electrical conductance, difference in electrical conductance or electrical signals. Okay? Between two locations. Again, yung membrane potential, that means difference in electrical conductance or electrical signals between two locations. Now, what are these two locations kung saan may difference in electrical signals? Okay, itong two locations, ang ginapasabot diri nga locations is yung, of course, outside ng cell, outside, okay, of the cell, and the other one is inside of the cell. Inside of cell. Okay, so yan yung involved na dalawang locations. Okay, yung two locations dyan. Again going back, with membrane potential, action potential, this is defined as the difference, okay, ng electrical conductance outside the cell and inside the cell. Now, in order for you to understand that, let's have a sample illustration. Say, for example, kani siya, kaning red nga horizontal, two horizontal lines, okay, na color red. Suppose this is cell membrane. Okay, suppose this is a cell membrane. Okay, halimbawa, yung nasa taas dyan, that represents outside of the cell. Okay, and then yung sa baba, yan yung inside of the cell. So, ito yung loob, yung nasa baba. Ito yung loob ng cell. So, ang point sa membrane potential, ano yung difference? Ano yung difference or pagkakaiba ng charges sa labas at sa loob ng cell? Again, kumbaga parang comparison, yung difference. Okay, yung difference pagkakaiba ng charges sa labas at sa loob ng cell. Now, please take note na with regards sa electrical charges, magkaiba ang concentration nila electrically sa labas at sa loob ng cell. Okay, comparing sa labas at sa loob ng cell. So, magkaiba sila. Okay, yung concentration ng electrical charges. Yan generally ang ibig sabihin ng action potential or membrane potential. Okay, so maybe karon sa inyong hunahuna murag galibog pa mo unsa karon ang importance ani niya. Okay, ano yung importance niya sa electrical conductance ng heart. Okay, ingani na siya. Very important ito, okay, yung membrane potential para para kasi ma-induce ang stimulation or kaya naman depression ng isang cell, example cardiac cell, kailangan magkaroon ng changes sa membrane potential. Again, para ma-induce yung stimulation or kaya naman depression ng isang cardiac cell, kailangan magkaroon ng changes dito sa membrane potential. That is why it is really very important to know the difference of the charges outside and inside the cell. Okay? So karon discuss nato ang cardiac action potential. Okay, cardiac action. Simulan natin yung cardiac action potential. May dalawang klaseng cells tayong pag-uusapan under this. Okay? Under cardiac action potential, dalawang klaseng cells yung pag-uusapan natin. Number 1, okay? Una, so dari na lang sa may gilid. Okay, una is yung mga non-pacemaker cells. Non-pacemaker cells. Okay? Yung non-pacemaker cells, pag sinabing non-pacemaker, syempre, these cells, they do not, normally, they do not initiate action potential. Normally, they do not initiate action potential. So, example of these non-pacemaker cells of the heart, okay, of the heart, na considered non-pacemaker cells are the following. We have atria or atrium, ventricles, and lastly, Purkinje fibers. Purkinje fibers. Okay? So, ito yung mga example ng non-pacemaker cells. Again, examples to ng mga non-pacemaker cells. We have atria, atrium, ventricles, Purkinje system. Now, take note, kani sila, mga non-pacemaker cells, they do not initiate action potential during normal condition. We're talking about the normal condition here, ha? Normal cell electrophysiology sa cardiac action potential ng non-pacemaker cells. Itong mga non-pacemaker cells na to, normally, dili sila ga-initiate og action potential. Normally. Now, meron din tayong tinatawag na pacemaker cells. Okay? Of course, yung pacemaker cells na introduce ko man kanina, 'di ba? Pacemaker cells. Okay? Base kanina na slide, ang part ng heart that is considered pacemaker is the SA node or sinoatrial node. Sinoatrial node. So please take note na we have non-pacemaker cells and we have pacemaker cells. So ang point diriya is magkaiba ang action potential ng pacemaker and non-pacemaker cells. Magkaiba yung cardiac action potential nila. So we have to discuss, okay, the cardiac action potential ng both. Okay? So start everyone sa non-pacemaker cells. Cardiac action potential ng non-pacemaker cells. So take note to stimulate changes sa membrane potential, to stimulate changes into the membrane potential, kailangan ng ion movements. Okay? Very much involved yung ion movements. Okay? To contribute in the changes sa membrane potential. Okay? So, puro ions ang pag-uusapan natin. Puro ions yung pag-uusapan natin sa part na to when we talk about membrane potential. Now, regarding sa action potential of non-pacemaker cells, these are divided into 4 phases. Again, they are divided into 4 phases. Now, for your reference, just check out this figure on the right side. Okay, yung figure on the right side. So, first, we have the phase 4. Okay, yung phase 4 dito. Ayan. Kaling naka-red. Naka-highlight na pala sila. Yung naka-red na line dyan, highlighted ko na red, Ayan. Ayan yung phase 4. Okay, phase 4. Ayan. Then, kining straight line. Ayan. Kaning straight line na pataas, yung kulay blue, kulay blue, straight line. Ayan naman yung phase 0. Okay, phase 0. Okay, again ha, yung phase 4 yung mga red lines. Okay, so itong andito, phase 4 to, phase 4, kanang straight line. Okay, then sa last portion din, di ba may nakalagay na 4, phase 4 din yan. Okay, yung flat line, phase 4 yan. Then yung phase 0, etong naka-vertical line. Okay, so naaman siya label, phase 0 na siya. And then we have phase 1, yung kulay orange dyan. Yung short na pababa, pababang line, short na pababang line, yan yung phase 1. Then phase 2, naka-label man, di ba? Phase 2, kanang black na akong gi-highlight. Okay? So, yan yung phase 2. Okay? Maura gihapon ni siya. Katong kani siya nga illustration ganina, akong gisulat-sulatan naman. Wala pa ni siya highlight. Okay? Maura gihapon na siya nga graph. Okay, kanilang ako lang gi-highlight para makita. Okay? Makita na to by segments per phases. And lastly, we have phase 3. Phase 3 kanang natirang kulay green. Yan yung phase 3. So again ha, please take note of these phases. You have phase 4, the flat line, the phase 0, yung straight vertical line, then yung pababa na short na pababa, short line pababa, yan yung phase 1, then another flat na pod nga line sa may taas, ito naman yung phase 2, ayan, then yung phase 3, ayan, yung continuous na pababa. Now, as mentioned kanina sa action potential, sa membrane potential, it involves ion movements. Ions, mga ions, particularly cat ions. So, bakit may flat line? Bakit may biglang tataas? May upstroke? Diba? Then, bakit may pababa? Then, mo-flat na po siya sa graph. Then, pababa ulit. Okay? So, we will explain all that in this part. So, discuss natin una yung phase 4. So, we have phase 4. Okay, phase 4. Yung phase 4, this represents the resting membrane potential. Again, this represents the resting membrane potential. Again, membrane potential, that is MP. Kamo na lang complete sa term. In other words, the cell is at rest. Diba? Resting membrane potential, the cell is at rest. And somehow mo yung idea. Pag sinabing cell is at rest, alam niyo kung ano yung charge. Okay? Ano yung mangyayari sa cell kung contract ba or relax. Diba? So, remember, kapag sinabi nating a cell at rest, kapag ang cell is at rest, ang charge overall is negative. Okay, overall, yung charge ng membrane potential is negative. Negative membrane potential. Okay? So, unsa itong gina-point out kung ang cell membrane potential is negative? Okay, ngayon na siya. For example, this is the cell membrane ulit. Kaning na yung mga vertical lines. Okay? So, ito yung cell membrane. Cell membrane. Okay? So, dito yung outside. Okay, outside ng cell. Then, inside ng cell. And as we defined kanina, ang membrane potential is difference. Difference daw ng electrical charges inside at saka outside ng cell. Now, kapag sinabing yung charge ng cardiac cell ay negative, ibig sabihin, kapag kinumpare natin yung charge sa loob, compare sa labas ng cell, more negative yung nasa loob. Okay? So, more negative yung nasa loob ng cell or mas negative sa loob ng cell. Ibig sabihin din yan, less cations. Di ba pag less cations, ibig sabihin mas dominated yung negative charges. Okay? Less cations are being found inside the cell membrane compared to the outside. Now, ang tanong, bakit kaya nagkakaroon ng negative charges ang phase 4? Okay, that is actually because of, please take note, that is because of potassium ion equilibrium. Okay, again, that is because of potassium ion equilibrium potential. Okay, potassium ion equilibrium potential. Okay, so for you to understand that, okay, kindly refer naman dito itong figure on the right side. Basically, kapag sinabi natin potassium ion equilibrium potential, that facilitates outward movement of potassium ion. So, yung movement ng potassium palabas. Okay? Movement ng potassium ions is outward ng cell. Normally, ang potassium ion kasi is actually found inside ng cell normally. Naalala ba yung piso sa PChem 1 mnemonics? Piso. Okay, piso. Mnemonics sa PChem 1, wherein yung PI dyan is potassium ions, di ba, inside the cell. Potassium ion inside. Potassium in. Okay, potassium in. So, normally, maraming potassium ion inside ng cell. So, normal yan na marami inside ng cell. Now, during phase 4, ang potassium ions, they move along the concentration gradient. Okay, they move along the concentration gradient. Ibig sabihin, lalabas ang potassium ions during phase 4. So, I repeat, may outward movement ngayon yung potassium ions during phase 4. Obviously, potassium ion is a cation, but it is carrying a positive charge. It carries positive charge. Therefore, kapag nagsilabasan ang potassium ions, kumusta ang potassium ion sa loob ng cell? Kung nagsilabasan sila, kumusta yung potassium ion inside ng cell, more or less? Siyempre, less. Okay, so less cations ngayon. Diba? Kaya nga dito, less cations. Okay, so less cations would mean more negative ngayon yung loob ng cell. Kaya nga, diba, as compared to the outside environment, mas negative ngayon ang loob ng cell. So, yun yung ibig sabihin ng membrane potential. Nagkakaroon ng pagkakaiba ng electrical charges between the outside and the inside ng cell. So, parang comparison siya ng inside at outside ng cell. Comparison ng concentration ng electrical charges na dapat magkaiba. Okay. Kaya nga sa phase 4, since resting membrane potential, okay, di ba resting membrane potential as illustrated on the figure. Okay, tingnan yung figure ngayon, yung graph. Tingnan yung graph. As illustrated on the figure, ang phase 4, di ba nara ang phase 4, kaning straight line. Ayan. Asa man siya naka-charge? It is charged at what millivolts? It is charged at negative 90 millivolts. So, resting talaga. Highly negative. More negative. Okay? So, that's it for phase 4. Okay? Phase 4. Now, let us proceed to phase 0. Yung kasunod. Phase 0. Okay. So, letter B na. Letter B. Okay. Phase 0. Okay, as observed sa phase 0, 'di ba, nag-shoot up yung kulay blue sa illustration. Yung kulay blue diyan, yan yung phase 0 ha, nag-shoot up ngayon, 'di ba? Nag-shoot up ngayon sa graph. Nag-shoot up ngayon yung graph line. Kapag sinabing nag-shoot up, we would expect here na ang inside ng cell magiging much more positive, 'di ba? Magiging much more kasi nga nag-shoot up. Nag-shoot up yung graph. So, kumbaga, opposite siya sa resting potential kanina na na-discuss. Kasi sa resting potential, di ba, highly negative yung inside ng cell. Kaya nga resting. Ngayon, nag-shoot up man siya, nag-shoot up ang graph sa phase 0, more cations ngayon. More cations ngayon ang inside ng cell compare sa outside ng cell. Now, for phase 0, please take note. This is known as we can describe this as fast, okay, depolarization. Okay, for phase 0, fast depolarization phase. Fast depolarization phase. Bakit siya tinawag na fast depolarization phase? Okay, this is because more of the sodium ion, more of the sodium ion channels open. Okay, more of the sodium ion channels open. Okay, so may sodium ion channel opening. Ayan, may sodium ion channels opening na nangyayari as compared to potassium ion channel. Now, kung babalikan natin ulit yung piso, balikan natin ulit yung piso na mnemonics, diba yung SO dyan, SO is sodium out. Diba, sodium out. So, normally, ang sodium ions, normally, they are found outside ng cell. So, sodium ions outside ng cell. Okay? That is normal. Kaya nga, di ba, kanina, kapag resting potential ang cell, mas negative talaga yung inside ng cell. Kasi nga, kahit yung sodium ions, they are found outside. Tapos nagsilabasan pa yun ang mga potassium ions, samot na magiging more negative yung inside ng cell. Okay? Now, for phase 0, yun na nga, mayroong sodium channel opening. So again, normally, maraming sodium ions outside ng cell. Now ngayon, nag-open man, okay? Nag-open ngayon yung sodium channels, okay? Nagkaroon ng fast depolarization. Okay, then di ba when we talk about channels, dapat ang movement ngayon ng ions of interest, it would be along the concentration gradient. Therefore, movement ng ions ngayon would be from high concentration to low concentration. Okay, that is why given this illustration, since more concentration ng sodium ion yung outside, yung movement is mula labas, papasok ng cell from high concentration to low. So, ang movement kayo ng sodium ions expected to be going inside the cell. Okay, again, when sodium ion channels open, that would mean entering of sodium ions inside the cell. Kaya dadami ang cations inside the cell. Kasi nga, sodium ion is a cation. And so, if we compare the charges inside and outside ngayon ng cell, nagkaroon na ng positive potential. Okay, inside ng cell, may positive potential na ngayon. Positive potential, hindi na siya resting, di ba? Hindi na siya resting phase. Okay, so positive potential. That is why in phase 0, please take note, there is stimulation. Or, di ba pag stimulation, that is contraction ng cardiac myocytes. Okay? Kaya fast depolarization, upstroke siya sa graph illustrated. Okay? Upstroke siya. Okay? Next is phase 1. Okay, let's have phase 1, letter C. Dito na lang, phase 1. Excuse me. So, sa graph, again, this is phase 1, no? Ayan, ganun siya. So, yan yung phase 1, yung maikling pababa. Ang phase 1, this is characterized naman by brief initial repolarization. Brief initial yan. Repolarization. Initial yan. Initial repolarization. Okay. So, brief initial repolarization. Yan yung phase 1. Yung phase 0, fast depolarization phase. Obvious naman, di ba, sa graph, nag-shoot up. Okay, nag-shoot up, straight line, shoot up. Okay, so fast depolarization phase. Phase 1, kung titingnan mo, di ba, maikling pababa. Maikling pababa. So, brief initial repolarization. Breakdown natin yung terms para mas maintindihan. Pag sinabing brief, di ba, pag brief, mabilis lang. Short-lived lang. Okay, pag initial, first time. So, kung titingnan natin sa graph, so far, ito yung unang nangyari na bumagsak ang graph. Diba? Unang nangyari na bumagsak ang graph. Meaning, pababa ngayon yung graph line. Ngayon, kapag bumagsak ang graph, we suppose here na opposite siya ng depolarization. Kasi pabagsak siya, hindi siya nag-shoot up. Diba? Pabagsak siya. So, opposite siya ng depolarization this time. Okay? So, ibig sabihin, less negative. Okay? Ang inside ng cell ngayon. I mean, more negative yung inside ng cell. Okay? More negative ngayon yung inside ng cell. So, dapat, ato i-expect in the phase 1, nabawasan ang positive ions. Nabawasan ang positive ions inside. Kasi nga, opposite ng depolarization. Dapat nabawasan yung positive ions inside. Then, repolarization. Repolarization, di ba? Ang nga prefix is again, di ba? It means again. Okay, and then polarization, polarize, ito yung attempt na ibalik sa resting potential ang cell, di ba? Attempt, di ba? Repolarization. So, attempt siya na ibalik sa resting potential ang cell. So obviously, since ibabalik sa resting membrane potential cell, we would expect here na negative ang inside ng cell. Negative ang inside ng cell. Kaya nga iba, yung ina-attempt na ibalik sa resting potential. So brief onset lang siya. Okay? Brief onset lang siya. Okay? Now, bakit ito nangyayari? Yung brief initial repolarization under phase 1. Okay, nangyayari to because okay, una, sodium ion channels, close. Okay. Again, nangyayari yung brief initial repolarization because sodium ion channels close this time. Again, close ngayon yung sodium ion channels. So, ibig sabihin, pag nagsara, let's say ito, di ba sodium channels to, nagsara, hindi ngayon makakapasok yung sodium cations inside ng cell, di ba? Hindi ngayon makakapasok yung sodium ions inside ng cell, so hindi talaga ma-favor yung positive potential inside ng cell. Kaya nga pabagsak siya dito sa graph. Okay, pabagsak siya dito sa graph. Also in phase 1, aside from sodium channels close, potassium ion channels open. Potassium ion channels open. So i-recall kanina na mention ko na, di ba, how was the movement of potassium ion if the channels of potassium ions opens? Paano yung movement ulit ng potassium ions? So, balikan natin yung slide kanina. O, ayan. Di ba? Kumusta yung movement ng potassium ion kapag nag-open yung gate niya? Di ba? It goes outside. Ayaw ginakalimti. Si potassium ion, pa-outward gina siya. Pa-outward iyahang movement. Okay, kasi galing siya sa loob. Diba? Normally, makikita sa loob yung potassium ions. Okay, so outward. Ngayon, ayan. So outward, pa-outward yung potassium ions. Then kanina, hindi makakapasok yung sodium ions kasi nga close yung sodium channel. Kaya ba? Close yung sodium channel. So pa-outward movement, then paano kung pa-outward movement yung potassium ions, then paano kung continuous? Continuous yan na nangyayari. Continuous na nangyayari na hindi makakapasok yung mga positive ions inside ng cell. Most probably, ang inside ng cell ngayon magiging less positive. Di ba? Magiging less positive. Kasi nga, hindi nakapasok yung sodium ions, palabas naman yung potassium ions. Kaya, less positive will be favored inside ng cell, kaya babagsak talaga siya sa graph. Diba? Babagsak talaga siya sa graph as shown in the illustration. Okay, so that is for phase 1, brief initial repolarization. Next is the phase 2. Okay, phase 2. Letter, ano na yan, A, B, C, D. Okay, so phase 2. Regarding phase 2 ng action potential non-pacemaker cell, please take note ha na ata sa non-pacemaker. Non-pacemaker cells. Example, yung cardiac action potential ng atria, cardiac action potential ng ventricles. Okay, so yung mga non-pacemaker cells. For phase 2 ng action potential ng non-pacemaker cells, this is known as plateau. Okay, this is known as plateau. Okay, kapag sinabing plateau, di ba, flat. Kapag sinabing plateau, flat, pantay. That is why, as you can see here sa graph, it has a flat line. Okay, meron siyang flat line. Now, bakit flat line yan? Because, please take note, there is balanced, okay, balanced movement. Movement of the following, okay, of the following ions. Particularly, we have calcium and calcium ions in calcium ion and potassium ions. Okay, so yan yung nangyayari. May balanced movement of calcium ions and potassium ions. Now, bakit? Bakit naman ang tawag ay balanced movement? And why plateau? Okay, so with regards to the movement ng potassium ion, of course, may idea na kayo. May idea na kayo regarding sa movement ng potassium ions, di ba? For the nth time, yung potassium ion goes outward. Di ba? It goes outward ng cell. That is for potassium ions. Okay, huwag kalimutan yung movement ng potassium ion kasi may mga drugs tayo that could alter, okay, this movement. Okay, so kapag pa-outward yung movement ng potassium, that makes the cell inside less positive. Diba? Magiging less positive yung inside ng cell kasi palabas yung mga cations. Now, paano naman yung calcium? Ayan, now for calcium ion, take note, papasok ito sa cell. Okay? For calcium ion, papasok ito sa cell. Sulat ko muna ha, less positive. Ayan. Okay? So again, for calcium ions, papasok siya sa cell. Okay. Bakit siya papasok ng cell? Naalala yung Miko. Miko naman na mnemonics. The CO dyan, yung CO dyan, calcium outside. Calcium outside. Okay, so ibig sabihin yung calcium ions, normally, they are found outside ng cell. Okay, isa siyang extracellular fluid cation. Okay? Kaya yung movement ng ions, di ba, along the concentration gradient. So going inside the cell, making the cell more Sulat ko ha, more positive. Kasi nga papasok. Papasok yan yung calcium. And so again, calcium ion enters the cell while potassium ion leaves the cell. Okay? So come to think with it. Ang potassium ion, it makes the cell polarized. It makes the cell polarized. Kasi nga, nafe-favor yung negative. Diba? Negative charge. Dito, nafe-favor yung negative charge. And that makes the cell polarized. And for calcium ion, ang calcium ion, it makes the cell somehow depolarized. Kasi nga, it makes the cell positive. Therefore, pag simultaneous yung pangyayari na to, simultaneous itong mga nangyayari, okay, sabay itong nangyayari, sabay sila, balanced. Ngayon ang upstroke, tsaka yung downstroke. Okay, yung upstroke at tsaka downstroke. Kaya nga ang result, flatline or yung term is plateau. Okay, flatline or plateau. Kaya yan yung representation sa graph. Okay, so this is the reason bakit na-established yung plateau phase. Okay, then finally, we have a phase 3. Ayan. Yung phase 3 naman, okay, regarding phase 3 of cardiac action potential ng non-pacemaker cells, this involves repolarization. Repolarization of the cardiac non-pacemaker cells. So when we talk of repolarization, ang nangyayari dito is that yung calcium ion channels closes. Okay? Or it close. Okay? Yung calcium ion channels close. And also, yung potassium ion channels remains open. Okay? So, ibig sabihin, si potassium ion channel, continuous yung movement niya. Continuous yung outward movement niya. Okay? Si calcium ion nag-close daw. Okay? Therefore, if close yung calcium ion, analyze natin, nagsara yung calcium ion channels, obviously, walang inward movement of calcium cations inside ng cell. Walang inward movement ngayon ng calcium ions inside ng cell. Therefore, ang magdo-dominate ngayon, less negative. Less positive. Okay? Okay, less positive ions inside ng cell ang mag-dominate karon. Kasi nga, hindi makakapasok yung calcium ions. Okay? Ngayon, kung less positive ang cell, we would expect na sa graph, of course, sa graph, tingnan yung graph, pababa ang graph line. Di ba? Kaya nga, di ba, as observed, okay, observed, sa green na, stroke, pababa. Okay? So, yan yung nagre-represent ng repolarization phase, phase 3. So, nangyayari yan kasi nga, yung calcium ion channels close, potassium ion channel remains open. So, palabas yung mga cations making the inside ng cell negative. Okay? Negative. Okay? Now, if this state continues, magdo-dominate na yung negative ions, okay, nagdo-dominate na siya, darating yung time na ma-re-establish yung resting membrane potential. And again, ang resting membrane potential ulit, it is charged at negative 90 millivolts. Negative 90 millivolts. Okay? Now, ngayon, kapag natapos to from phase 4, Okay? To, to phase 3. Kapag natapos yan, then back to phase 4, isang tibok yan ng non-pacemaker cell. Okay? Isang tibok yan ng non-pacemaker cell. Halimbawa, si atria, di ba, non-pacemaker cell man siya, or kaya naman ventricle. Okay? So, sa bawat ganitong graph, okay? Sorry, nabitin. Again, sa bawat ganitong graph, isang tibok yan. 1 beat. Okay, 1 beat. Then, second beat, parang ganyan. Then, third beat. So, bali yung representation dyan, yung isang complete action potential, that represents 1 beat. Okay, 1 beat ng cardiac non-pacemaker cell. Okay? I'm not talking about the whole heart nga beat ha. Yung cell, yung cardiac cell na non-pacemaker cell. Example, yung atria. Okay, isang beat yan. Nagre-represent yan ng isang beat ng atria or isang beat ng ventricle. Okay? So, per graph. Pag natapos yung action potential na yan. Mula phase 0 to phase 3, then back to phase 4. Okay, so isang buong action potential yan, isang buong tibok ng isang non-pacemaker cell. Okay, so kailangan nyo talagang kabisaduhin to. Isipin nyo na lang na yung potassium ion always palabas ng cell. Yung sodium ions kanina, papasok ng cell. Calcium ion, papasok din ng cell. Kabisadihin nyo per phases. Okay, kung open ba ang channel or close ba? Para ma-apply nyo kailan siya polarized, kailan siya flatline, kailan siya repolarized, di ba? Kailan depolarized or upstroke, and so forth. Okay? So, that is for the cardiac action potential ng non-pacemaker cells. Okay, try natin i-reinforce. Okay, nalang ko i-reinforce kung nadumduman ba ninyo. If you still remember yung discussion ko under vasodilators about the term hyperpolarization, naalala ba yung hyperpolarization? Di ba kapag hyperpolarization, sobrang negative ang cell? Kasi nga, ano yung nangyayari? Bakit sobrang negative yung cell? Diba? Anong channel ang bukas? Anong channel yon na bukas? Okay, open ang potassium ion channel. Kaya nga, may outward movement of potassium ions. Okay? So, making sense na magne-negative yung inside ng cell. So, gi-recall na ako para somehow ma-reinforce yung knowledge nyo. So, taken all together, okay, that's the end again of action potential, cardiac action potential ng non-pacemaker cells. So, recall members ng non-pacemaker cells, atria, atriums, ventricles, Purkinje systems, or yung Purkinje fibers. Moving on, proceed tayo sa cardiac action potential ng pacemaker cells. Okay? Normally, sabi natin, the one that dominates as pacemaker cells are the ones found in the sinoatrial node. Diba? Sinoatrial. And I have mentioned, kapag sinabi nating pacemaker cells, these are the ones that stimulates the action potential. Sa kanila magsisimula ang action potential. Okay, sila yung mag-i-initiate ng action potential. Considering na walang external stimulus pa yan, okay, they can actually initiate heartbeat. Okay, normally, they can initiate heartbeat. So, meron tayong iba't ibang phases din under pacemaker cells. Una, as you will observe, sa action potential ng pacemaker, okay, itong sa graph ha, Kung titingnan niyo, may phases na wala sa kanya pero meron sa mga non-pacemaker cells, 'di ba? 'Di ba? So wala siyang flat line. Kung titingnan niyo, walang flat line, particularly walang plateau. Okay? So no plateau. Anong phase 'yun? Anong phase ba 'yun? Yung plateau. Phase 2. So take note, sa SA node as pacemaker cell, sa cardiac action potential niya, walang plateau. Okay? Walang phase 2. Okay? Therefore, kung walang phase 2, wala tayong ma-observe na balanced movement of potassium and calcium ion. Diba yung pag-describe ko kanina sa phase 2 is yung plateau, that is mainly influence, yung factor na yung reason or yung factor that affects bakit plateau, nagkakaroon ng plateau is because of the balanced movement ng calcium tsaka potassium ion. So in here, we cannot observe balanced movement ng potassium tsaka calcium ion. And also, ano pa yung wala? Walang yung brief na initial repolarization. Diba? Yung maikling pababa. Okay? So, walang short-lived repolarization. Anong phase yun? Anong phase yung short-lived repolarization? Diba phase 1? So, take note, no. Okay? No phase 2. Okay? And phase 1 din. Walang phase 1 din sa pacemaker cell. Okay? Wala yung saglit. Diba? Hindi ka makakakita ng saglit na pagbagsak sa graph. Walang plateau. Okay? So, ingana ang itsura. As you can see mo na siya ang itsura sa action potential ng sinoatrial node as a pacemaker cell. So, sugod na diri sa phase 4. Naka-label naman, di ba? Ito yung phase 4. Yan yung phase 4 ng pacemaker cell sinoatrial node. Tingnan sa graph ang phase 4. Kung inyuhag yung tutukan, ng malapitan, di ba, dili siya straight line. Di ba, dili siya straight line pareha sa non-pacemaker cells. May konting slope. Di ba, may konting slope. Di ba, paana siya? May konting slope. That is why we cannot actually tell na yung nasa pacemaker cell action potential, there is negative charge. Okay, dili man siya flat line. Okay, dili siya flat line. So, dili ta mag-conclude, di kita makakonclude na sa pacemaker action potential na phase 4, there is negative charge. In fact, ang phase 4 particularly ng pacemaker cell ay unstable resting membrane potential. So, sulat ko ha, yung phase 4, unstable resting membrane potential. Again, this is characterized by unstable resting membrane potential, yung phase 4 ng SA node. Okay? Kaya siya unstable dyan because hindi siya actually nagre-rest. Diba? Unstable. Hindi siya actually nagre-rest, in which dili gyud kay ang pacemaker, diba? As pacemaker, siya ang mag-i-initiate ng contraction. Diba? Siya man ang mag-initiate ng action potential. So, siya yung mag-initiate ng contraction. Kaya, ang phase 4 dito sa mga pacemaker cell, cardiac action potential ng pacemaker cell, somehow depolarized. There is depolarization sa phase 4. Susulat ko ha, depolarization. Ayan. And please take note, normal na siya. Normal thing yan. Kasi nga, pacemaker siya. Okay? Pacemaker siya. Okay? So, siya gid ang mag-initiate sa contraction. So, dili na pwede siya nga negative charge, flat line. Dili pwede. Somehow, dapat na siya slope. Okay? Unstable. Kaya nga unstable yung resting membrane potential. Okay? Now, ang tawag natin sa phenomenon na to is, or yung property is automaticity. Automaticity. Again, ang tawag natin sa phenomenon na to, or property na yun, is automaticity. Okay? Yung automaticity that is defined as spontaneous depolarization. Spontaneous depolarization. Okay? So, I repeat, normal na siya. Normal thing sa SA node. Sa SA node, normal thing na siya as a pacemaker cell. Again ha, ang pacemaker cell, wala siyang phase 1 and phase 2. Yung phase 4 niya, unstable. Resting membrane potential. Okay? Kasi nagkakaroon ng spontaneous depolarization. Okay? Another important phase niya, ang kanang sunod, phase 0. Okay? Ang phase 0 naman ng pacemaker cell, this is characterized by calcium ion conductance. Okay? Calcium ion, conductance. So, sulat ko ha. Oops. Ayan. Ito yung sa phase 4. Okay. Then we have phase 0. Phase 0, again, this is characterized by calcium ion conductance. Okay? Calcium ion conductance. And we also have phase 3. Di ba yung kasunod sa 0? Phase 3. By the way, yung calcium ion conductance, ibig sabihin yan, yung inward flow ng calcium ions. Di ba? Normally, nasa labas yung calcium ion. So, pag may calcium ion conductance, papasok yung calcium ions. Okay? Then, yung phase 3 dyan, repolarization. Okay, repolarization. Okay? So, overall, yan basically yung nangyayari sa pacemaker cells, particularly sa sinoatrial node. Again, under sa cardiac action potential, we have non-pacemaker cells and the pacemaker cells. Okay, so please remember this kasi reflective related to sa ECG. ECG later. And aside sa ECG, also sa mga actions ng drugs. Related to sila. Okay? Now, moving forward, let us now discuss electrocardiogram or yung ECG. Okay, this is also the ECG. So, ano ba yung importance ng ECG or electrocardiogram? Basically, ang electrocardiogram, this holds the records. Okay? Records. It holds records of heartbeats. Okay? It holds records of heartbeats. Bali, siya yung nagsiserve as proof. Proof siya, evidence regarding the way our heart contracts, okay, or how our heart beats. Okay, yan yung ECG. Now, may mga distinct areas kayong dapat malaman regarding ECG. Okay, so first up, we have this one, P wave. Okay, yung P wave. Okay, isang part ng electrocardiogram. P wave, that stands for atrial depolarization. Atrial depolarization. Again ha, ang P wave, that stands for atrial depolarization. Atrial depolarization, diba, it tells us that during P wave, kapag may umbok, kanang murag na bugdo sa P wave, sa kaniha, kaning sa illustration, kapag may umbok, may pump, may bugdo, okay, ang P wave dyan, that means yung atria, it contracts. Kasi nga, atrial depolarization, di ba? Depolarization, stimulation, contraction. Okay, so pag may umbok dyan sa P wave, ano yan, indicator yan na yung atria contracts. Okay, so that is how to interpret, kumbaga. Kung nakakita mong ECG, kita mong umbok sa yung P wave, contraction ng atria. So that's what we mean for atrial depolarization. Second, as you can see sa baba, diba, sa baba may broken line. You can see the so-called PR interval. Okay? Next is PR interval. Okay. Sa PR interval naman, that is the period. Okay? Period between the beginning of P wave, then beginning of Q wave. Diba? Kung imuhang lantawan ang iyahang sana, kung asa siya naka-label. Okay? Diba? Gikan siya sa start, beginning ng P wave, then tingnan, beginning ng, until the beginning sa Q wave. Diba? Ito yung Q. Beginning siya ng Q wave. Nag-end. Okay? So again, ang PR interval, period siya. Okay? Period. That is the period. Diba? Kasi yung period time. Mag-span ng time between the beginning sa P wave, then beginning sa Q wave. Unsa karon gina-describe ng PR interval? Ang PR interval naman, that is actually color coding naman eh. Okay, AV nodal, that is actually AV nodal, atrioventricular nodal conduction velocity. Ayan. Conduction velocity. Ayan, again ha, ang PR interval, that is the atrioventricular nodal conduction velocity. Okay, so ano ulit yung AV nodal conduction velocity? Ito yung time consume. Okay, time yung period. Okay, na na-consume kung saan naipasa yung action potential from the SA node going to the atrioventricular node. Okay? So, ito yung time. Kung saan naipasa, yung time na na-consume na naipasa yung action potential. Siyempre, magmumula sa SA node. Okay? And gaano yung time na na-consume? Ilan yung time na na-consume? Parang ganun. Okay, yan yung PR interval to AV node. Okay, period. Ayan, period. Okay, again ha, period na na-consume kung saan ang action potential ay tinransmit from SA node to AV node. You can watch again yung video. Marag na-emphasize man to sa video about aning AV nodal, yung conduction velocity, yung pagpasa ng action potential mula SA node to AV node. Okay, so that is the atrioventricular conduction velocity. Or, actually, ito yung medical term niya is yung dromotropy. Na-introduce ko man yata yung dromotropy. Okay, dromotropy of the heart. Okay, conduction velocity, di ba yun? Conduction velocity, yan yung dromotropy. Particularly, yan yung atrioventricular nodal conduction velocity. Okay. Now, I will give a sample case para mas maintindihan yung importance ng AV nodal conduction velocity or dromotropy. Sample case, for instance, regarding PR interval, ha? For example, if, lagay ko, if, yung PR interval, short. What if yung PR interval is short? Mubura. Short, maikli. Okay? Kung short ra, ano yung magiging implication ngayon kapag maikli lang yung PR interval reflected sa ECG? Okay? Ano yung magiging implication? Okay, so ulit tayo. Di ba ang PR interval, period siya. It represents the period, time travel ng action potential mula SA node papuntang AV node. Mula sinoatrial node to atrioventricular node. Now, kung short lang ang travel, okay, short lang, maikli lang yung PR interval, okay, kumusta ngayon yung travel ng action potential mula SA node to AV node? Is it fast or slow yung period ng time? Fast ba or slow yung period time ng travel ng action potential mula SA node to AV node? Okay, it is fast. Okay, so yung transmission ng action potential is said to be fast. Okay? So take note, kapag fast gani ang action potential nga travel time, ibig sabihin, mabilis yung heartbeat. Okay, ibig sabihin nun, mabilis yung heartbeat. Kasi nga, naipasa na siya agad, mabilis yung heartbeat ngayon. Fast man yung action potential ngayon. So, faster yung heartbeat. Kaya nai-induce yung positive dromotropy. Diba? Positive dromotropy. And recalling your knowledge, recall ninyo inyong knowledge about positive dromotropy under ANS drugs. Knowledge niyo about autonomic nervous system drugs. Diba? Pag sinabing positive dromotropy, it implies sympathetic autonomic nervous system effects, diba? Or SANS, sympathetic autonomic nervous system effects. Okay? Then, kung longer ni siya, ang PR interval, kung long, syempre, yung time travel ngayon ng action potential mula SA node papuntang AV node, mas slower. Diba? Slower ngayon yung conduction. Okay? So, sulat na lang na ako. Ayan. So, if longer naman, so diri na lang. Under ni siya sa PR interval, ha? Sa inyong notes, under ni siya sa PR interval. So, if long naman, slow. Diba? Yung time travel. Again, we're talking about time here sa PR interval. The period man, period. Okay? So, slow ngayon. So, negative dromotropy. So, kabaliktaran lang. Dromotropy. Okay? Then, obviously, na-induce yung, it implies para sympathetic autonomic nervous system effects. Okay? This is for long, ha? Kung long PR interval, slow ang conduction, negative dromotropy, para sympathetic effects. Now, let us proceed to QRS. Okay, ito yung QRS complex. Okay. So, ayan. Again, QRS complex. QRS. Okay, ang QRS complex naman, this is from the beginning. Okay, tingnan yung graph. Mula sa beginning ng, hindi pala siya graph, illustration. Okay, ng sample ECG. Okay, so, gikan siya sa beginning ng Q wave until the end of, dots. Gikan siya sa beginning ng Q wave, then end ng S wave. Beginning ng Q wave, end ng S wave. Yan yung QRS complex. Okay, for QRS complex, take note, this is ventricular depolarization. Again, it represents ventricular depolarization. Again, yung P wave kanina, atrial depolarization, yung pag-contract ng atria. Ito naman, QRS complex, yung pag-contract ng ventricles. Contraction ng ventricles. Yung kanina, PR interval, yung time yon, time span ng travel ng action potential, yung transmission ng action potential mula SA node sa pacemaker cell until sa atrioventricular node. Next up, we have ST. After QRS complex, we have here the ST segment. Ayan, ST segment. Okay, when we talk about ST segment, that is from the end. So, end ng S wave. Okay, end siya ng S wave. And then, beginning siya ng T wave. Diba? Ayan. So, end siya ng S wave. And then, beginning until the beginning of T wave. Yan yung ST segment. Okay, from the end of the S wave until the beginning of T wave. Na as observed, ang ST segment, meron siyang flat line. Diba flat line man siya, as shown in the figure. So, ang tawag sa segment na to is isoelectric. Isoelectric. And this is characterized by the period when ventricles are depolarized. So, period din yung nare-represent kay time. It has something to do with the time when the ventricles are depolarized. Okay? So, yan yung sa ST segment. This is actually connected or related to phase 2. Okay? Related to siya sa phase 2 ng cardiac action potential under non-pacemaker cells. Siyempre, wala kasing phase 2, diba, sa pacemaker cells. Ano yung phase 2? Sa non-pacemaker cells. Diba sa phase 2, action potential, kanina sa slide, may balanced movement of ions sa potassium and calcium ion. Ito yung plateau. Diba? Plateau. So, related siya somehow. Related siya somehow sa phase 2, yung plateau. Okay, so that is also yung phase 2, yung plateau, that is also the ST segment. Related lang kasi yung cardiac action potential sa ECG. Okay, yeah. Kaya nga it shows flat line dito sa illustration, yung ST segment. Next, we have T wave, letter T yan, T wave. Ang T wave naman is ventricular, dito na lang, T wave. Yung T wave naman is the ventricular depolarization. Okay, re. Kay re na siya. Re pala. Kasi may pababa na. Okay, repolarization. Again ha, yung T wave dyan, that represents ventricular repolarization. Then we have last, itong nasa baba, Q yan, QT interval. Okay, Q. Okay, sumpay na lang siya. QT interval. Ang QT interval naman, period din. Okay, period din yung nire-represent. Ayan. QT interval. Okay, so for QT interval, period particularly ng depolarization and repolarization. So period of depolarization and repolarization. Okay, depolarization and repolarization of the ventricles. Okay, again, QT. QT interval, total period ng depo. So, contraction, then repolarization, so relaxation ng ventricles. Now, bakit magkasama yung period ng depolarization and repolarization sa QT interval? That is because, kung titingnan mo yung label ng QT interval, di ba? Ayan, it involves the QRS complex. Di ba? Mula sa QRS complex, then, involved din yung ST, di ba? Involved din yung ST segment, and then, finally, T-wave. Di ba? Mula QRS complex papuntang T-wave, yan yung covered ng QT interval. Kaya kung sama-sama sila, di ba, magkasama ang contraction tsaka relaxation. Kasi nga sa T-wave, may repolarization, may relaxation. Sa QRS, ano sabi natin sa QRS complex? Ventricular depolarization, the opposite of T-wave. Diba? So, sama-sama yung contraction tsaka relaxation ng ventricles na kina-cover, okay, ng QT interval, period, being covered, okay, ng relaxation and contraction ng ventricles. So, overall, yan yung basic parts ng electrocardiogram. Okay, so going back, we have the P wave, and then we have the, by the way, yung P wave, yun yung atrial depolarization. PR interval, yun yung dromo, diba? Dromotropy. Okay, kasi it describes the atrioventricular nodal conduction velocity, diba? From the name itself, conduction velocity. So, dromotropy of the heart, PR interval. Okay, and the QRS, so andito na slide, QRS complex ventricular depolarization. ST segment, ito yung period of depolarization of ventricles, which is related to phase 2, yung plateau. Yung T-wave ventricular repolarization and QT interval, total period of contraction and relaxation. So yung time na na-consume. So that's it for electrocardiogram. So you have to know this. Kaya pag abot sa mga drugs, puros graph ang gina-alter ng mga drugs. Okay? So with that, okay, let us now combine electrocardiogram and cardiac action potential. Okay, yung kanina na-discuss na cardiac action potential plus yung kaka-discuss lang na electrocardiogram. May relationship kasi sila. Okay, so as I've mentioned, ang pacemaker ng heart, we have sinoatrial node. Okay? So, ayan yung sinoatrial node being labeled. And kung titingnan mo ang graph ng action potential niya, tingnan sa may right side. Ayan. Okay. So, may right side, yung mga action potentials yan. Okay? Kung titingnan mo yung graph ng action potential, since ang pacemaker cell, SA node, walang plateau, di ba? Nasabi ko kanina, SA node, pacemaker cells, walang plateau, walang phase 2, walang flat line. Okay? Wala din siyang phase 1. Ano lang meron? Phase 0, phase 3, and phase 4. Diba? And ano sabi ko sa phase 4? Phase 4 ng sinoatrial node, ng mga pacemaker cells. Diba? Hindi siya katulad ng phase 4 sa mga non-pacemaker cells. Kasi yung sa pacemaker cells, yung phase 4 niya, may paakyat na konti. Diba? May slope. Kasi nga, somehow, depolarized. Somehow dito, depolarized or may depolarization. Phase 4 ng SA node. And for atria, ayan, atria, of course, this is classified as non-pacemaker. So that is why, as you can see, may plateau. Diba? Meron siyang plateau na makikita sa graph ng action potential. So, di lang masyadong halata. Diba? After phase 1, may plateau dyan. And then phase 3. Okay? So, may plateau dyan. Next, ang atrioventricular node. Atrioventricular node, isa rin siyang pacemaker. Actually, isa din siyang pacemaker. But, during normal condition, latent pacemaker siya. Latent pacemaker. Ibig sabihin, ng latent pacemaker, it does not normally initiate conduction. Okay? Or action potential. Kung walang problema ang katawan, walang problema yung puso. Okay? So, kung normal condition, hindi siya katulad ng SA node. Yung SA node kasi, kahit walang external stimulus, okay, normal condition lang, it initiates action potential. Pero, yung atrioventricular node, pacemaker din siya, pero, yun na nga, latent pacemaker, sa normal condition, it does not initiate conduction or action potential kung walang problema ang heart. So, ang tendency, iyahang graph, kung titingnan mo, since pacemaker man siya, halos parehas lang din ng SA node. Okay? So, walang plateau, di ba? Walang phase 2. Okay? Wala din siyang phase 1. So, that is for AV, atrioventricular node. Now, ang Purkinje fibers, non-pacemaker cells, diba? Tatlo yung na-mention ko na non-pacemaker cells. Atrium or atria, ventricles, tsaka Purkinje fiber. So, same graph. Same graph lang ng sa atrium. Okay, yung Purkinje fibers na action potential. Same graph lang sa atrium. Yung nasa taas. So, very apparent yung 5 phases. Di ba? From 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And finally, ventricles. Okay, yung ventricles, isa din siyang non-pacemaker. Okay, non-pacemaker cell. So, bottom line, pag non-pacemaker, na-establish ang membrane potential. Wherein kung titingnan mo, very well established yung resting membrane potential. While sa pacemaker cell, hindi tayo makakakita ng flatline, di ba? Or plateau. Okay? Walang flatline, walang plateau. Okay? So, yan yung difference ng action potential ng pacemaker at non-pacemaker cells. Okay? So, ang point here, kaya tuloy-tuloy ang depolarization. Kaya tuloy-tuloy ang depolarization sa sinoatrial node. Okay? Kasi nga, as the pacemaker, sa kanya magsisimula yung action potential. Sa kanya manggagaling yung action potential. Okay? And then, yung nasa baba, for ECG, ECG graph, if you'll observe, ang P wave, tingnan mo yung P wave. Diba? Meron ka mapapansin na broken line sa taas niya. Diba? Yung P wave nakaturo siya actually dito sa atrium. Okay, itong part na to ng atrium, yung phase 0 ng atrium, nakaturo siya sa phase 0 ng atrium. Why do you think so? Ano ba ulit definition natin sa P wave? Ano yung definition natin sa P wave? Okay, balikan yung slide. P wave, 'di ba? It is atrial depolarization. Okay? Atrial depolarization. That is why nakaturo siya sa phase 0 in particular ng atrium. Okay? So, yan yung relationship nila. Also, sa ECG, makikita natin yung PR. Of course, yung PR interval, di ba sabi natin ito yung travel time ng action potential. Di ba, travel time ng action potential mula sa SA node, then papuntang atrioventricular node. So, take note ha, sa PR interval, involve yung sa period ng time or travel time, involve yung mula sa SA node, then until AV node. Okay, so yan yung PR interval. And then kapag QRS complex, okay, yan yung contraction ng ventricle. Diba? Kaya makikita na somehow nakatapat siya. Diba nakatapat siya dito sa phase 0 ulit ng ventricles. Kasi nga, di ba sa phase 0, di ba nag-shoot up? Fast depolarization. There is contraction there. Okay, ng particular cardiac cell. Okay? So, somehow, di ba, naka-point siya, yung QRS. Kasi nga yung QRS, iyang gina-describe, ventricular depolarization, contraction ng ventricles. Okay? And then we have T wave. Di ba nakaturo siya somehow dito sa phase 3. Okay, phase 3 ng Purkinje system. Ano ba ulit yung T wave? Di ba ang T wave repolarization? Okay? Repolarization. So kung repolarization, is it relaxation or contraction ng ventricle? Of course, relaxation. Okay, relaxation ng ventricles. Kaya nga 'di ba, somehow nakaturo siya sa phase 3. Phase 3 kasi, kung inyong i-scan over ato ang slides kanina, ang phase 3, repolarization din. Obvious man sa iyang graph, di ba, pababa. So, repolarization. Okay? So, yan ang relevance ng cardiac action potential sa ECG graph, or ang relevance ng ECG graph towards cardiac action potential. So, pohon, pag makakita mong ECG, or magpa-ECG mo, at least somehow na amoy general idea. Diba? Dili gyud specific interpretation sa datas ng ECG, pero at least na may general idea lang niya siya about ECG. So let us now proceed to conduction velocity. Okay, although na-discuss naman ako niya siya, di ba? Na-discuss na ako ng conduction velocity kanina, particularly sa may AV, atrioventricular nodal conduction velocity, yung termed as dromotropy. Di ba? Particularly yung dromotropy. Sulat ko na lang. Ayan. So, yan din yung atrioventricular nodal conduction. Okay. Conduction velocity, sabi, it reflects the time required for excitation to spread throughout the cardiac tissue. Spreading of excitation is very important, okay? Take note, spreading of excitation, that is very important for the heart to contract. Okay? For a specific part of the heart to contract. Particularly, it depends on the inward current, okay? Or inward movement ng certain ions, okay? Specifically during upstroke, okay? Na action potential. Recall, pag sinabi nating upstroke, we expect that movement of sodium ions comes into play. Diba? Sa atrioventricular nodal conduction velocity, nagkakaroon doon ng sodium channel opening in particular, yung pagpasok ng sodium ions. And so, sa conduction velocity, it is said to be fastest. Take note, sa conduction velocity, fastest daw in Purkinje system. Okay, conduction velocity, fastest in the Purkinje system, wherein kapag Purkinje system, diba, that is sa part ng ventricle in particular, sa part ng ventricle. Kasi nga, yung Purkinje, diba, makita man siya kaganina sa atong illustration sa heart, sa first slides, kay ang Purkinje system, makita siya sa lateral part ng ventricles. Okay, in particular, conduction velocity ng ventricles ng Purkinje system. Okay? Meaning, kapag mabilis yung Purkinje system, mabilis ang conduction velocity sa Purkinje system, mabilis yung pump, mabilis yung contraction ng ventricles. Again, I repeat, kapag sinabing fastest in Purkinje system, yung conduction velocity daw fastest in Purkinje system, meaning mabilis ang pumping or ang contraction ng ventricles. Okay? And then sabi, slowest ang conduction velocity, slowest sa atrioventricular node. Ibig sabihin, normally, ang pasa ng action potential mula SA node, okay, going to atrioventricular node, okay, normally slow gyud, mabagal. Okay, that is normal. Sa normal condition ng heart, normal gyud ang pasa, ang period ng time. Yung time na dapat ma-consume ng pagpasa ng action potential mula SA node sa pacemaker papuntang AV, atrioventricular node. Now, bakit? Bakit normally mabagal? Okay. That is because it allows filling time. Okay? Bakit siya mabagal? Again, it allows filling time of the blood. Sorry. Ayan. Okay? Which is na-mention to sa video. Na-mention niya siya sa video. Okay? Kung babalikan nyo kasi yung chambers ng puso, di ba? If this is the heart, so kung heart ni siya. Okay, pero dili gini nga na ha, ang itsura sa heart. Kung mo na siya ang heart, then di ba na diri ang atria, then diri ventricles. Okay, kaya mabagal yung pagpasa ng action potential mula SA node, example, andito yung SA node, then andito yung atrial ventricular, di ba? Atrial ventricular, so somehow gitna ng atrium tsaka ventricles. Okay? Okay, mabagal yung pagpasa ng action potential mula SA node papuntang AV node para makapagbigay ng enough time, sapat na oras ng pag-fill in ng blood papuntang ventricles. Okay? So hanggang mapunta siyang ventricles. Okay? Kaya siya mabagal or slow. Okay? Mabagal or slow in the atrioventricular node. Normal yan. Very normal. Kapag mabilis kasi, imagine niyo, kung mabilis ngayon yung transmission ng action potential mula dito sa sinoatrial node, okay, papuntang AV node, okay, ano yung magiging implications nito sa filling time? Ano yung magiging implications nito sa filling time kung paspas kayo ang action potential? Ano yung mahitabo karon sa pag-fill in sa blood, okay, into the ventricles? Walang enough time ngayon for the filling of blood into the ventricles. Ibig sabihin bitin yung filling time. Diba? Dahil mabilis ngayon yung pagpasa ng action potential, yung dami ng dugo sa atria, okay? Example, may dugo dito sa atria. Okay? Yung dami ngayon ng dugo mula sa atria, hindi lahat maipapasa sa ventricles. Hindi lahat maipapasa sa ventricles. Kasi nga, ang bilis ng action potential travel mula SA node papuntang AV node. Okay? So, bitin ngayon. Kung bitin ngayon yung filling time, konti lang yung maipapasa, di ba? Bitin ngayon yung mai-eject na dugo ng ventricles. Di ba yung ventricles yung mag-i-eject ng blood towards the circulation. Therefore, bababa yung cardiac output. Di ba? Yung output, yung blood output ng heart. Okay? So, very important to know this concept para alam nyo normally, di ba, na mabagal talaga normally yung conduction, yung action potential sa atrioventricular node. Okay? Sa atrioventricular node. Okay? Next, after conduction velocity, and let's talk about excitability. Okay, proceed sa excitability. Ang excitability, this is also known as refractory period. So, diri na ta mag-focus sa refractory periods. Again ha, excitability. This is also described as refractory periods. In particular, ang pinaka-common sa action ng drugs is the so-called effective refractory period. Okay, pinaka-common yan sa action ng drugs. When we say ERP, or effective refractory period, that is the period, okay, period during which a conducted action potential cannot be elicited. Again, period during which the conducted action potential cannot be elicited. Okay, what do we mean by that? Okay, for example, in this figure, yan sa left side na figure, kapag sinabing ERP, or effective refractory period, that is the period from phase 0, okay, period siya from phase 0 until phase 3. So, phase 0, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so that is the ERP. Now, ano yung pino-point out ng ERP, effective refractory period? Ibig sabihin yan, ito yung oras, period man. Ito yung oras na kung saan hindi pwedeng mangyari ulit ang isang panibagong action potential. Again ha, hindi pwedeng mangyari ang panibagong action potential. Okay? Pag sinabing effective refractory period. Ibig sabihin yung cardiac cells are said to be resistant to the stimulus. So for example, ito. For example, ito ay action potential. Ayan. Okay? Ito yung normal, 'di ba? Na isang tibok ng isang cardiac, particular part ng cardiac cell. Example, a non-pacemaker cell or a pacemaker cell. Okay? So meron siyang phase 4. Yan, phase 4. Then phase 0. Then 1, 2, 3, and back to phase 4. Now, ang point ngayon ng effective refractory period, dapat lahat ng phases na yan, it has to be completed first. Bago yung kasunod na action potential ulit. Okay? So, kailangan matapos to lahat. Okay? Ito lahat. Matapos yan lahat. Hanggang, di ba, mula phase 0, then until phase 3, then back to phase 4. Kaya nga, di ba, effective refractory period. Ito yung oras mula, di ba, mula 0, mula phase 0 to phase 3. So, normally, sa normal case, again ha, sa normal case, dili pwede mangyari na mula, ingani lugar, mula phase 4, then phase 1, okay, then phase 2, then hindi pa nga natatapos yung phase 3, ayan, biglang phase 0 na naman. Okay, then phase 1, phase 3, then biglang phase 0 na naman. So, parang ganun. Okay, so hindi yan pwede. Okay, hindi yan normal. Okay, hindi siya normal pag ganito yung nangyayari. Hindi pa nga natapos yung phase 3, phase 0 na naman. Okay, so dapat matapos muna yung phase 3. Okay, bago ulit ang next set of action, potential conduction, para matawag na effective refractory period. Okay, so that's it for excitability. Okay, and then we have, last na, autonomic effects. Okay, sa autonomic effects naman, parasympathetic and sympathetic effects, they could affect chronotropy and dromotropy here. Again ha, ang para tsaka sympathetic nervous system, they can affect chronotropy and dromotropy. So, simulan natin sa chronotropy. Again, ang heart, particularly, di ba, ang chronotropy, heart rate. Okay, heart rate. Okay. Ang chronotropy, ba yan yung heart rate. Sa illustrations natin kanina sa cardiac action potential, di ba, related ang heart rate sa firing ng SA node. Firing of SA node. Now, firing of the SA node or sinoatrial node, this talks about phase 4. Okay, phase 4 of sinoatrial node. Phase 4 of sinoatrial node ng cardiac action potential ng sinoatrial. No, di ba ang phase 4 ng non-pacemaker cells, ano yung in-emphasize ko, yung phase 4 niya, hindi siya katulad ng sa non-pacemaker na resting, but somehow depolarized. So recall ulit, okay, depolarization, may depolarization, okay, sa phase 4 ng pacemaker, sa action potential ng pacemaker, particularly ng sinoatrial node. Now, may effect ang parasympathetic and sympathetic, okay, nervous system sa chronotropy or sa phase 4, depolarization. Okay? Kapag parasympathetic or parasympathetic autonomic nervous system, this is characterized by slow. Okay? Slow pans na lang ako ibutang. Pag pans, ayan, characterized yan by slow phase 4. Okay, depolarization. Slow phase 4 depolarization. Ibig sabihin, kapag slow phase 4 depolarization, mabagal yung pag-shoot up. So, parang mabagal pa. Like, then, I have pa mag-shoot up. So, sobrang bagal. Okay? Yung pag-shoot up ng graph for phase 4 sa SA node. Therefore, mabagal ang rate ng contraction. Diba? So, negative chronotropy. Di ba? Kung imagine, mabagal daw yung depolarization. Di ba? Phase 4 ng SA node, depolarization, contraction. Kung mabagal yung contraction, negative chronotropy. Negative yung rate. Mabagal yung rate. Yung kapaspason bitaw mabagal. Yung rate ng contraction. Okay? Kapag sympathetic naman, hindi rin na lang sa ubos. Sympathetic, okay, autonomic nervous system effects, okay, mabilis ang phase 4 depolarization. Kasi nga, it increases the rate. Faster ngayon yung rate. Okay, so this is positive chronotropy. Okay, again ha, kapag sympathetic naman, it increases the rate or fast ang rate ng contraction. So, mabilis yung phase 4 depolarization. So, sa graph, mabilis yung, kung tanong to sa graph, mabilis lang. Mabilis lang yung pag-form ng slope. Okay, mabilis. Okay, therefore, mabilis yung transmission, kumbaga, ng action potential. Mabilis yung transmission ng action potential. Yung firing ngayon ng SA node. Okay, or the pacemaker cell na sinoatrial node. And then, for dromotropy, na-discuss ko na to kanina, di ba? Sige, recap lang nato. Kapag dromotropy ulit, ito yung oras. Oras ng pagpasa ng action potential mula SA node to AV node. So, ako gina-repeat yung oras o period. Okay? Okay, kasi ito yung atrioventricular nodal conduction velocity or dromotropy. And normally, di ba, mabagal. Mabagal yung pagpasa. Bakit? Ano yung importance? To allow filling time ng blood in the ventricles. Okay? So, ulit, kapag dromotropy, okay, sa ECG, ang gina-represent sa dromotropy is yung PR interval, di ba? PR interval. Okay? And I've mentioned earlier na kapag short ang PR interval, short lang yung PR interval, that is said to be positive. Okay, positive dromo. Di ba? Positive dromotropy. Okay, kung short. Okay, yung PR interval. Kasi kung shorter ang PR interval, mabilis yung pagpasa ng action potential. Positive dromo. Okay? Paspas ang conduction velocity. Then, that is for sympathetic. Sympathetic ni siya nga effect na sympathetic effect. Okay, so SANS. Then, kabaliktaran lang, pag long, yung PR interval, negative. Dromotropy. Okay? So, parasympathetic effect. Again ha, kung longer PR interval, negative. Dromotropy. So, parasympathetic effect. So, kapag mga catecholamines yung pag-uusapan, like norepinephrine or epinephrine, catecholamines, pinapabilis nila yung contraction because of shorter PR interval. Okay? Now, taken all together, yan ang effects ng sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system sa chronotropy and dromotropy. Chronotropy ulit, heart rate. Okay? Heart rate. Dromotropy, conduction velocity. Sa ECG, that is represented by PR interval. Yung period, yung time consumed ng pagpasa ng action potential mula SA node papuntang atrioventricular node na dapat normally mabagal. Okay, normally dapat mabagal. Okay, to allow filling time. Okay? So, overall, we are done. We are done with cell electrophysiology ng heart. Okay? Tapos na tayo sa cell electrophysiology ng heart. Okay, by the way, regarding chronotropy, emphasize ko lang, regarding chronotropy, yung determinant, diba, is heart rate. Okay, determinant ng heart rate, diba, chronotropy is heart rate. Okay? Now, yung determinant natin ng heart rate sa chronotropy, okay, or yung determinant natin for chronotropy, determinant natin for heart rate is SA node lang, sinoatrial node lang. Okay? Again, ang determinant natin for chronotropy, sinoatrial node lang. Then yung dromotropy, SA node and atrioventricular node. Kasi time man siya. Conduction velocity, time man siya, period, mula SA node. Yung pagpasa ng action potential mula SA node to AV node. So, done with cell electrophysiology of the heart. Now, before we proceed to the next topic, recap sa cell electrophysiology. Mabilisan lang nga recap. Starting with cardiac action potential. Okay, sa cardiac action potential, di ba nabanggit ko na magkaiba ang pacemaker cells, tsaka non-pacemaker na cells. Sige, try nyo sagutin kung sa inyong mind while listening. Okay? Try nyo sagutin kung non-pacemaker ba yung dinedescribe ko or pacemaker cell ba. Okay, number 1, resting membrane potential. Resting membrane potential, non-pacemaker or pacemaker? Okay, non-pacemaker. Okay. Okay, next, plateau. Yung graph is with plateau, with a flat line plateau. Okay, non-pacemaker cells. Paano naman yung brief initial repolarization? Brief initial repolarization. Okay, non-pacemaker cells din. What about sinoatrial node? Sinoatrial node, okay, pacemaker. What about phase 4 nga depolarization. Phase 4 nga depolarization. Okay, pacemaker. Now, ano yung mga phases? Phases na wala sa pacemaker. Ano yung mga phases ng cardiac action potential na wala sa pacemaker? Di ba? Phase 1 tsaka phase 2. Okay, next, ventricles. ventricles, pacemaker, non-pacemaker. Okay, non-pacemaker. Diba? Kasama niya si atrium, Purkinje fibers. Okay, recap naman tayo sa ECG. Okay, sa electrocardiogram. Ano ang tawag natin sa atrial contraction? Or atrial depolarization. Atrial contraction, P. Okay? Papa, P, wave. P, wave. Okay? Ano naman yung dromotropy? Anong letter yon na nagre-represent sa ECG? Dromotropy. Okay, PR interval. Ano naman tawag sa buong relax and contract ng ventricles? Yung combination ng repolarization, depolarization ng ventricles. Anong part 'yon ng ECG? Okay, QT interval. Next, ano yung tawag sa ventricular repolarization? Ventricular repolarization. Sa electrocardiogram na figure. Ventricular repolarization, it is the T. Okay, tata, T wave. Next, anong part naman ng ECG graph ang nag-represent sa phase 2 non-pacemaker actions potential? Ano yun? Anong part yun? Nag-represent sa phase 2 or plateau non-pacemaker action potential. Anong part yun ng ECG? Ang also related sa phase 2 or plateau ng action potential, it is the ST segment. Okay? Okay, sige. Proceed tayo sa conduction velocity. We discussed dromotropy, diba? In the Purkinje fibers and also in the atrioventricular node. Yung conduction velocity, which is fastest, then may slowest. Okay, saan ulit mabilis ang conduction velocity? Purkinje or atrioventricular node, saan normally mabilis? Okay, sa Purkinje. Okay, bakit mabagal yung atrioventricular node? Bakit mabagal? 'Di ba? Very important yun to allow filling time to facilitate enough filling ng blood sa ventricles. Now, kapag mabilis yung dromotropy, kapag mabilis yung conduction velocity or dromotropy, mabilis, kung mabilis, is it less or more cardiac output? Less or more cardiac output ba yung result? Okay, less cardiac output. Kasi nga mabilis. Mabilis yung conduction velocity, short lang. Short lang ngayon yung filling time. Kulang ang time ng pagpasa ng dugo from atrium to ventricles. Okay, excitability naman. Okay, diba? Excitability, this is also described as effective refractory periods. Okay, pag sinabing refractory, diba? Duration between what phases? From 0 to 3. Phases 0 to 3. And during normal conditions, we need to finish the phase 3. Kasi kapag hindi, extra contraction yan. Diba? Dapat na-finish gid siya. Okay? That is for the effective refractory period. Next, ano yung medical term natin sa heart rate? Ano yung medical term natin sa heart rate? Chronotropy. Conduction velocity, dromotropy. Okay? Sige, try nyo sagutin kung chronotropy or dromotropy. Okay? Phase 4 depolarization. Phase 4 depolarization. Okay, chronotropy. Diba? Kakadiscuss ko lang kanina na slide. Chronotropy. Okay? Yan yung related sa phase 4 depolarization. Okay? Yung sa firing ng SA node. Okay? So, related lang din yun sa phase 4 depolarization. What about PR interval? Chronotropy or dromotropy? PR interval. Okay, dromotropy. What about sinoatrial node? Sinoatrial node only. Sinoatrial node only. Yung firing ng sinoatrial node. So, chronotropy. What about with atrioventricular node? So, SA node tsaka AV node yung involved. Okay, dromotropy.